This is an oral history of Lois Finkelman on March 17th, 2015. The interview is being conducted by May Sebel. Good morning, Lois.
Good morning, May.
Thank you for welcoming us into your home. We're very interested in your background for our archives. We're thrilled that you're going to be honored at the ANSACOR event. But most importantly, we will have this oral history for our archives. Tell me about your childhood, growing up, where you're from, your family.
I grew up in Chicago, in the city, not in a suburb, in an apartment. I never lived in a house till long after I was married. It was interesting. My grandparents were around on both sides, and both my grandmother and my mother were amazing examples of community volunteers. They were very active in the Jewish community. My grandmother was doing volunteer work at a home for the aged when she was well into her 80s. And she would talk about those old people. So I grew up with kind of being part of the community as part of my culture. I never thought differently about it. I have a younger brother who's a psychiatrist in Chicago, with all of his children and all of his family around, whereas we moved here for my husband to do a pediatric residency many years ago, with no intention of staying in Dallas. Dallas was a way stop along the road to somewhere. We weren't exactly sure where the road was going, but somewhere. And lo and behold, after being here for 3 years, we never seriously thought about leaving.
Well, Dallas is very lucky that you decided to stay. Returning to your childhood, tell me about your family's involvement in the Jewish community there in Chicago.
Well, my father was an accountant, had an office in downtown Chicago. My mother and my grandmother were members of B'nai B'rith, and my mother was a member and an active member of council. I think my grandmother was active in Hadassah over the years. And for the most part, their circle of friends turned out to be a group of women and men that they had gone through high school with. And they stayed lifelong friends. The last remaining one of those women passed away a couple of months ago. So we were very much a Jewish family, although like many Jewish families in Chicago in those days, we didn't spend a lot of time in temple. We belonged to a large Reformed congregation, and we were all confirmed, and my brother was bar mitzvahed. There weren't a whole lot of bat mitzvahs in those days, so that wasn't part of my background. But I think being Jewish was always part of how we would have defined ourselves. And I think that from generation to generation was kind of what got passed on to me, hopefully passed on to some of my children. Growing up in Chicago was a phenomenal experience because in those days, while we lived in the city, not far from Wrigley Field, we could get on our bikes and ride south to the Lincoln Park Zoo, which my friends and I often did, or get on our bikes and ride north to Evanston, which is where I ended up for college, interestingly enough. And I had a tremendous amount of freedom. Just a tremendous amount of freedom. I loved growing up in a big city where there was lots going on and lots to do, but I think what I didn't realize was what I really, really loved was the freedom to kind of come and go as you pleased. My mother never drove me any place, very much unlike life here with our kids growing up where someone was always driving them somewhere. And we rode our bikes. It was really a wonderful place to grow up. And in some respects, I kind of miss not being able to have given our kids that kind of life. But I don't know that that kind of life exists anymore in the same way it did when I was growing up.
That's interesting to hear. That's very true. Tell me about your college experience.
Well, I was a diehard University of Michigan fan and had applied to Michigan as a junior and received early acceptance and had my housing for a year and a half following. And then my father became very ill. And it was my senior year, and my mother said to me, "Will you please not go away to college?" Even though Ann Arbor wasn't very far from Chicago, it was far enough that she kind of felt she wanted me closer. So I marched myself up to Northwestern, and I said, here are my grades. Will you take me? I don't need housing. I can live at home as a freshman. And fortunately, the fates played their role, and I did end up at Northwestern, eventually on campus, of course. And that's where I met my husband, who was a year ahead of me at Northwestern, and we had a wonderful 3 years together. It was a wonderful place to go to school in those days. All the advantages of being in Chicago and the advantages of being in a somewhat smaller community. Evanston was small by comparison in those days. It probably still is. I don't know what the population is. And Northwestern had a very tight Jewish community for those who lived on campus. Lots of activities, lots of social life. And academically stretched one's mind enough so that at the end of the day when you walked out, you felt like you had a good education.
And what ultimately brought you to your husband's pediatric residency?
Right. We had gone from Chicago. He graduated and went to Ohio State Medical School, which is where he was from. I graduated the following year, and my mother, in just a classic example of mothers of those days, said, "You can't go to Columbus unless you're married." Now, would any of us think to say that to any of our kids? Of course not. But she did, and like a good girl, I called Ross, and I said, "Ross, I can't come unless we get married." And his parents had been saying, "Why don't you wait till you finish medical school?" which was another 3 years. And that was not acceptable to either one of us. So indeed, we got married the day after I graduated college and headed off to Columbus. We're in Columbus for the following 3 years of his medical school. Went back to Chicago for an internship, during which Ross decided that he wanted no part of living in Chicago long term, that he was commuting as an intern, and it was not a pleasant situation. We were living in a 4th floor walk-up that had no hot water and sometimes had no heat. But I was close to home and all of my old friends and family, so I was really happy. But then we left after his internship and were sent to Little Rock Air Force Base for his 2 years in the Air Force. Spent 2 years at Little Rock. Which turned out to be a wonderful experience, except for the specter of being sent to Vietnam, kind of being held over our heads. Fortunately, it didn't happen. By the time he finished, he decided he wanted to be a pediatrician. And the program in Dallas at Children's was the one he wanted to be in. And we were lucky enough for him to be accepted, and as they say, the rest is history. We're here, our roots are here now.
How did you get started in community life here in Dallas, all your volunteer work? And
Geez, that's a really good question, and I guess there are a couple of answers to that. As a very young mother, I became involved in the League of Women Voters and National Council of Jewish Women. and continue my membership in those organizations to this day, probably from a volunteer aspect. Occasionally I'm still doing things with council when someone calls me and says, will you do this? But somewhere along the way, I got involved in more civic-oriented things. I had been interested in the environment and ended up being president of a local environmental group called Save Open Space, whose goal it was to preserve floodplains and protect open space and lobby for parks at City Hall. And a spot had become available on the park board for the city. And Jerry Bartos, who was then the council member representing much of this part of North Dallas, called me and asked me if I wanted to serve. And I jumped at the chance because typically in those days, those spots were coveted, and they typically went to someone who had either played a major role in someone's political campaign or had written a significant check. That turned out to be part of what led me to where I was at City Hall. I guess I'd forgotten prior to that, I'd chaired the Park and Open Space Board for Dallas County. I'd gotten involved in Dallas County Parks and Open Space Board and sat on that board for many, many years and was the second chair. And then I guess transitioned to the city of Dallas and the park board there, and then served for almost 8 years. And when you serve in a board like that, you really get to know the community, and you get to know neighbors and neighborhoods, because you become the point person for anything the neighborhood is concerned about with respect to a park. And because I was there so long, I really had built up, I think, a number of relationships. And when I was in my last term on the park board, I began to get calls from people who wanted me to consider running for city council, which is something I had never considered. I had no ambitions to be an elected official. I was perfectly happy being on the park board. But that was going to end regardless of how I felt about it. And after giving it much thought, after Ross and I talking about it, our kids were at a point where my being involved in something that was as demanding as that was time-wise wasn't going to be an issue. They were capable of putting peanut butter and jelly sandwich together quite effectively. So I said yes, and was successful, and then spent my 4 terms on the city council, which I think was both fascinating and frustrating and energizing and all of the possible various terms one could think of. I went on council at a point in time where the city budget was in very bad shape, so every year we were cutting things rather than looking to see what we could improve. And then before I rolled off, things got better, and we were in good shape, and we were looking to do some new things, exciting things. So it was an exciting time to be around. I served on council under 2 different mayors, Ron Kirk and Laura Miller, and had been appointed to the park board as president initially by Steve Bartlett when he was mayor, and then by Ron Kirk when he was mayor. So I had lots of different political backgrounds from a standpoint of those kind of relationships, and I think that helped. I think that helped me think about what's going on in different parts of the city, how different neighborhoods are affected differently by different kinds of things, and are interested in different kinds of things. things. You know, what's important to someone who lives on my block may not be important to someone who lives in East Dallas or West Dallas or South Dallas. And as a council member, it's important to make sure that everybody's happy. City needs to prosper and be considered as a whole, I think, as much as possible. There's probably a little bit too much divisiveness going on for me.
You have served on so many boards and advisory boards. How have you managed to balance all that?
You know, I don't know that I have done any more than anybody else, but I seem to have a relatively high energy level. I've still managed to keep up my tennis, which I think kind of keeps me stable. You know, it keeps me out of, I shouldn't say North Park, but it keeps me out of the shopping malls or other places where I might be spending my time. And then I just have always felt that, you know, the nonprofit world is a critical part of what makes a city special. And to be able to have been a part of some of those organizations who either were social service kinds of organizations, providing services or financial support in the social service area, or like today, serving on the Dallas Zoo Board, because I think the zoo is such a critical part of what makes our city special. You just do it. You fit it in.
What is your favorite thing? What's
what
the
is my
favorite
favorite?
board that you've served on?
Oh, that's almost an unfair question because I think it kind of depends on what I'm thinking about. I serve on the Associates Board of Children's, which is one of those boards where you really feel good about the fact that a children's medical center exists in Dallas. You don't ever want to have to take your children or grandchildren there for medical services. But if you do, you realize how lucky we are to have children's in the Dallas community. I sit on the State Fair Board, and what could be more fun than you know, having kind of backstage access to the State Fair of Texas every year. And then the zoo, which interestingly enough was my first volunteer role in 1980 when we first kind of moved here and I was getting situated. My kids were at a point that I could actually get away to do some volunteer work. I was a zoo docent. I had a partner and we took animals to schools and we would talk to the primarily lower school kids about what it means to have a pet and what kind of animals make good pets and how you have to be responsible. And we had a snake and we had sometimes a pig and we had an Amazon green parrot and my partner at one point lived in a house off of Straight Lane and had sheep, and we would load up one of her sheep and put it in the back of a trailer and take it to an elementary school in Dallas. So that was my very, very first, and it was the first year that the Junior League had given up the school docent program at the zoo and opened it up to non-Junior League members. And it was great fun. I did that for a number of years. And then at this point to have been lucky enough to have chaired the Dallas Zoo Management Board, which was the operational board when we privatized the zoo 6 years ago. And to see the zoo just blossom. I mean, I don't know whether you've been there lately, but if you haven't, as an adult, it's worth going down there on a beautiful day, probably not when it's 100 degrees out, and walking around. It's not the same zoo we took our children to, and it's not the same zoo we all remember. It's a new and different place. It's recognized by zoo people all over the world, and all over the country. So it's exciting now to be a part of that still and see it moving on. Even though my role has changed again. We collapsed the board I had chaired, and I sit on the Zoological Society board now. But that's great fun, you know, and there's always something there's always something new. I recently got involved in the archives of the Women of the Southwest at SMU, part of the SMU library system. And they're collecting papers from women like you, like me, and archiving them for future students and educators to go through in order to have a record of what it was like to be a woman during a certain period of time or doing a certain thing somewhere in the Southwest. It's not limited to Dallas or Texas. And that's been fun and interesting, a field that I probably knew very little about.
Have they gotten any materials from Jewish?
Yeah, oh yes, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I think Ann Margolin's papers went there last year.
Okay.
And mine will go there. No, absolutely. And they are always looking for papers. So if you know of someone who would be interested in, you know, for the most part, our kids don't want those papers. They're going to sit in a box in the garage or in the attic and get moldy and mildewed and moth-eaten. At least they will be in a place where at some point someone will go through them and they will be maintained and cherished and ultimately, I'm sure, digitized
And researchable.
and researchable for someone. So yeah, no, that absolutely, there are Jewish women who have donated their papers there, and Jewish women who have served on the board and are currently serving on the board. So it's very broadly reaching out.
Excellent. Anything else you would like to add? You've had a very exciting, interesting life to date.
Well, you know, I don't know what the future holds. I'm glad that we're here right now. I feel very fortunate and very blessed that of all the places where we might have ended up, we did end up in Dallas, because I found the community here one that was easy to find a niche and fit into. It was easy to get involved in the Jewish community, easy to get involved in temple. And then for me, because I ended up spending probably less time being involved in the Jewish community than I would have otherwise, you know, I kind of took a little detour and got more involved on a civic basis, which, as I said, was not something I sought, not something I thought would ever happen. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope that, you know, in retrospect, when somebody looks at my papers 50 years from now, they may say, oh, well, she did a nice job.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Is it on? Let's hear about your grandparents.
Well, I think that probably the most interesting one of my grandparents was my mother's grandmother, who grew up in Romania, married as a young woman. She and her husband moved to Paris, and he was a couturier designer, and she was a couturier seamstress, and they had a brief career in Paris, and his family by then had all immigrated to Chicago. And so they pulled up stakes before my mother was born. Her sister was already born, moved to Chicago, where my grandfather had 7 or 8 siblings, and his parents all living kind of closely together as they did in those days. And I can remember when I was growing up, my grandmother was always really independent. And she used to tell me stories about when she was a young woman. And one of her favorite stories was after they'd been in Chicago a while and my grandfather was working at, I think, Carson Peary Scott or one of the downtown department stores. My grandmother by then had 2 babies. My mother was probably 2 or 3, and her sister was a couple of years older, and my grandmother went and got herself a job because she was bored staying at home taking care of the children. There were enough family around that someone else could do that while she worked, and she had a skill that she wanted to use. And she used to delight in telling me the story that her mother-in-law, who I gather was rather imperious, said to her that you cannot work, you must quit your job because everyone will think that your husband can't take care of you. And as the years rolled on, my grandmother became a suffragette, and when I was growing up, if I wanted to push the envelope at all, it was always my grandmother that I went to for approval before I had a conversation with either one of my parents, because she was much more willing to be open-minded and progressive.
What kind of work did she do?
She was a seamstress. She was a seamstress. And as I grew up, she would sew clothes for both my mother and I. And my grandfather died when I was little. She later remarried, and she remarried a man who was in the cap business, used to make men's caps, men's hats, I guess. They weren't caps, they were hats. And she would come home with men's suiting fabric and would make my mother and I a skirt or a vest or a jacket. And I can remember one day I went off to school and I had on, it was either navy or gray, it was a dark color, and there was all these white threads. And I was convinced that the skirt had just been basted. And if I were to pull the thread, the whole thing would fall apart and I would be standing there in my underwear. And I can remember calling my grandmother from school. I must have been in 7th or 8th grade, and saying, you know, this is what happened, what should I do? And she reassured me that the skirt had indeed been sewn. She just had forgotten to take out the white basting tape, and I could pull the thread out. So I did that. But she continued to sew till she was quite elderly. She had one of those old Singer sewing machines, that the pedal machines that we had, and unfortunately my mother let it go. My mother was never very sentimental. When they broke up my grandmother's apartment and she moved to Florida, a lot of those things that in my mother's eyes were just old and no longer needed kind of got sold off or given away. I would have liked to have maintained that pedal
Well, it
sewing machine.
sounds like you really got your genes from your grandmother.
There's no question. I'm probably in many respects much more like my grandmother than my mother. Although in fairness to my mother, she did okay, but she was much more. I think, you know, she was much more concerned about being the parent and
Well, your grandmother
and
was
towing
very
the line.
progressive.
And my grandmother
Very
was
progressive.
very progressive. My grandmother was indeed very progressive.
And what
it
about
was
your
an
father's
inspiration.
parents?
My father's parents were immigrants from Russia, not highly educated, and neither one of them worked once they moved here. He kind of continued. Well, I guess they had worked when he was a young man, but by the time I really remember them, they were older not working and living in a small apartment. My grandfather used to come every Friday night for dinner. My grandmother died when I was about 12. And my grandfather was around up until when I was in college. But it was interesting. We didn't have the same kind of relationship. You know, they were very much of a different generation and a different culture, and never totally adapted to living in the United States, speaking English.
Well, thanks for sharing that
Thank
extra
you.
information with us.